9 words from a woman who once owned private jets made Ellen DeGeneres question everything she thought she knew about wealth, success, and what really matters in life. But it wasn't the words themselves that stopped Ellen mid-sentence. It was the quiet dignity with which they were spoken by someone who had fallen from the highest heights imaginable and somehow found peace in the wreckage. The moment those 9 words filled the studio, Ellen's show became something unprecedented. A masterclass in how to lose everything and still discover what it means to be truly rich. The cameras kept rolling, but for 57 seconds, television stopped being entertainment and became education in the most profound lesson of human resilience ever captured on film. Because sometimes the most valuable stories come from people who have lost everything except their wisdom. Let me take you back to how we reached that moment of stunning revelation. It was a bright Wednesday morning in March at Stage 1 on the Warner Brothers lot. Ellen DeGeneres was preparing to tape what should have been an inspiring segment about successful entrepreneurs who had given back to their communities, a celebration of American achievement and philanthropy. The kind of uplifting content that reminded viewers that dreams really could come true. Victoria Sterling sat in the green room, her hands folded quietly in her lap, wearing a simple gray dress from Target that she had bought for $12. At 52, Victoria carried herself with an elegance that money couldn't buy and poverty couldn't take away. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and though her jewelry was minimal and clearly inexpensive, there was something unmistakably refined about her presence. To anyone who didn't know her story, she looked like a successful professional woman preparing for a television appearance. But Victoria Sterling had once been worth $3. She had been invited to the show after a local news story about her volunteer work at a women's shelter had mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that she was the former CEO of Sterling Industries, one of the largest tech companies in the world, before its spectacular collapse 5 years earlier. The story focused on her current work helping homeless women find jobs and housing, but Ellen's producers had been intrigued by the dramatic fall from grace that had preceded her current life of service. During the pre-interview, Victoria had been articulate and thoughtful, discussing her volunteer work with genuine passion. She talked about the women she helped, the systemic issues that led to homelessness, and the programs she was developing to address long-term solutions. But when asked about her past as a billionaire, Victoria's responses had been brief and matter-of-fact, as if she were discussing someone else's life. Ellen had sensed there was more to Victoria's story, a depth of experience that went beyond the typical rags to rags narrative. There was something in Victoria's eyes, a hard-earned wisdom that suggested her journey had taught her lessons that most people never learn. Now sitting across from her on the familiar set, Ellen began the segment with her characteristic warmth and curiosity. The audience responded with polite applause as Ellen introduced Victoria, highlighting her current charitable work and mentioning almost casually her previous success in the business world. "Victoria, I have to say, your dedication to helping others is truly inspiring," Ellen began, settling into her chair with genuine admiration. "But I'm curious about your journey. You've experienced both incredible success and significant challenges. How do you look back on that time in your life?" Victoria's smile was serene, but Ellen caught something in her expression, not sadness exactly, but a kind of peaceful acceptance that suggested deep self-reflection. "Ellen, I think most people misunderstand what happened to me," Victoria said quietly. "They see it as a tragedy, losing billions of dollars, watching an empire collapse, going from private jets to public transportation. But honestly, it was the best thing that ever happened to me." The audience stirred slightly, surprised by her perspective. Ellen leaned forward, intrigued. "That's a remarkable way to look at it. Can you tell us what happened? How does someone lose that kind of wealth?" Victoria took a measured breath, and when she spoke, her voice was clear and steady, with no trace of self-pity or regret. "I lost everything in one day, Ellen. Not gradually, not over months or years. One day I was worth over $3 billion. The next day I had nothing, and it was entirely my own fault." The studio fell quiet as Victoria continued, her words carrying the weight of hard-earned truth. "I had built Sterling Industries from nothing, Started in my garage with a laptop and a dream. We developed revolutionary software for financial markets, and within 15 years we were one of the biggest tech companies in the world. I had everything money could buy: mansions, cars, art collections, investments all over the globe. I thought I was untouchable. Ellen's expression grew more serious as she listened. This wasn't the typical business failure story she had expected. What changed? Ellen asked softly. Victoria's composure remained steady as she revealed the truth she had never spoken publicly before. I got greedy, Ellen. Not just successful, greedy. I started making decisions based on ego rather than ethics. When the 2008 financial crisis hit, instead of protecting my employees and clients, I made a series of increasingly desperate investments to maintain my lifestyle and status. I used company funds for personal ventures. I took risks with other people's money that I would never have taken with my own. The audience was completely silent now, understanding they were witnessing a confession of extraordinary honesty. The final decision, the one that destroyed everything, was investing the company's entire liquid assets in a cryptocurrency scheme that I knew was risky, but promised massive returns. I told myself it was a calculated business decision, but the truth was simpler. I couldn't stand the thought of scaling back, of appearing vulnerable, of admitting that even I could be affected by economic downturns. Ellen felt her breath catch as Victoria continued. The investment was a scam, a sophisticated one, but a scam nonetheless. In 24 hours, Sterling Industries lost $2.8 billion. The company collapsed. 15,000 employees lost their jobs. Pension funds were wiped out, and I lost everything except the crushing knowledge that it was entirely preventable. What happened next was unprecedented in Ellen's career. She stood up slowly, walked around the coffee table, and sat down next to Victoria, taking her hands in a gesture of support rather than judgment. "Victoria," Ellen said gently, "that must have been devastating. How did you survive something like that?" Victoria's eyes filled with tears for the first time since the interview began, but her voice remained steady. The lawsuits came immediately. Criminal charges, civil suits. By the end of the week, everything was gone. Houses, cars, bank accounts, investments. Everything seized by courts or creditors. I went from boardrooms to bankruptcy court, from private jets to homeless shelters. Ellen squeezed Victoria's hands tighter. "You were actually homeless for 8 months." Victoria nodded. "I stayed in shelters, slept in my car when I could afford the gas, ate at soup kitchens. The woman who once owned a wine collection worth more than most people's houses was standing in line for free meals. And you know what? Those were the most educational 8 months of my life." The audience was completely transfixed, many wiping away tears as they witnessed this extraordinary confession. "What did you learn?" Ellen asked. Victoria's smile returned, radiant despite her tears. "I learned the difference between being rich and being wealthy. When I had billions, I was rich. But I wasn't wealthy. I was actually incredibly poor. Poor in spirit, poor in relationships, poor in purpose. I had money, but I didn't have meaning. I had possessions, but I didn't have peace." Ellen felt her own eyes filling with tears as Victoria continued. "In the shelter, I met women who had nothing but were some of the richest people I'd ever encountered. They shared their last dollar with someone who needed it more. They comforted each other through tragedy. They found joy in small kindnesses. They taught me that wealth isn't what you have, it's what you give. It's how you treat people when you have nothing to gain from them." What Ellen did next surprised everyone, including herself. She turned to address the camera directly. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we're witnessing right now is extraordinary. Victoria isn't just telling us about losing money, she's teaching us about finding something far more valuable." She turned back to Victoria. "You said losing everything was the best thing that happened to you. Can you explain that?" Victoria's response would become one of the most quoted statements in Ellen's show history. "Ellen, when I had billions of dollars, I thought I was successful. But success isn't what you accumulate, it's what you contribute. When I lost everything material, I found everything meaningful. I discovered that true wealth isn't measured in what you can buy, but in what you can give, not in what you own, but in who you help, not in your net worth, but in your true worth. The studio erupted in spontaneous applause, but Victoria wasn't finished. Those 9 words I spoke when we started, it was the best thing that ever happened to me. They're not just optimism or rationalization, they're the literal truth. Because the woman who lost everything was able to find something the billionaire never possessed: purpose, peace, and genuine happiness. Ellen stood up and announced something that would change both Victoria's life and the lives of thousands of others. Victoria, what you've shared today, this wisdom, this perspective, it's invaluable. I want to do something. First, we're going to support your work at the women's shelter. But more than that, I want to help you create something bigger. A program that teaches real wealth, the kind you can't lose in market crashes or lawsuits. The audience cheered, but Ellen continued. Because what you've taught us today is that the most successful people aren't always the ones with the most money. Sometimes they're the ones who've learned that true success is measured not by what you gain, but by what you give. What happened next was pure magic. Ellen announced the creation of the True Wealth Foundation, funded by donations from viewers and designed to teach financial literacy alongside values-based living. Victoria would lead the program, sharing her unique perspective on success, failure, and the difference between being rich and being wealthy. The episode that aired 4 weeks later became one of the most watched and most shared in Ellen's show history. But more importantly, it sparked a national conversation about success, wealth, and what really matters in life. Victoria's story resonated with millions of people who were struggling with their own definitions of success and worth. Her message that losing everything can teach you what nothing else can became a beacon of hope for anyone facing financial difficulties or questioning their life's direction. The True Wealth Foundation grew rapidly, offering not just financial education but life education. Victoria's workshops taught people how to build sustainable success based on values rather than just profits, how to find meaning in work beyond just income, and how to measure wealth in ways that market crashes couldn't touch. 6 months after her Ellen appearance, Victoria published a book titled Broke and Rich: What I Learned from Losing Everything. It became an instant bestseller, not because people wanted to read about financial loss, but because they wanted to understand how someone could emerge from such devastation with such wisdom and peace. Victoria never regained her billions, and she never wanted to. She lived simply in a modest apartment, drove a used car, and wore clothes from discount stores, but she was richer than she had ever been as a billionaire, because her wealth was now measured in lives changed, people helped, and purpose fulfilled. Ellen featured Victoria's progress in several follow-up segments, but the most powerful one came 2 years later, when the True Wealth Foundation had helped over 10,000 people develop new relationships with money, success, and happiness. Victoria had become a different kind of millionaire, not in dollars but in impact. The irony, Victoria told Ellen during that follow-up interview, is that I'm more successful now than I ever was when I had billions. Because success isn't about what you can afford, it's about what you can't afford to live without. And what I can't afford to live without is purpose, connection, and the opportunity to help others avoid the mistakes I made. 3 years after that first appearance, Victoria was featured in a documentary about redefining success that won several awards, and was shown in business schools and community centers across the country. But she always insisted that the most important part of her story wasn't the fall, it was the discovery that you can only find your true wealth after you've lost everything you thought was valuable. People ask me if I regret the decisions that cost me my fortune, she said in one interview. And the answer is complicated. I regret the harm I caused to others, my employees, my investors, the families affected by my choices, but I don't regret the journey that led me to understand what true wealth really means. Ellen often reflected on Victoria's impact on her own understanding of success and purpose. Victoria taught me that the most important question isn't how much is enough, but what is enough for. Ellen said during her final season, she showed us that you can lose everything and still be rich, or have everything and still be poor. The True Wealth Foundation continues to operate today, teaching people that sustainable success is built on principles that can't be lost in market crashes. Integrity, generosity, purpose, and the understanding that true wealth is always measured in what you give, not what you get. Victoria Sterling lost $3.2 billion in one day. But in losing everything, she found something invaluable. The knowledge that the only wealth worth having is the wealth that makes others richer too. Her 9 words, "It was the best thing that ever happened to me," became more than just an optimistic perspective. They became a roadmap for anyone seeking to understand the difference between financial success and a truly successful life. Ellen DeGeneres built her career on celebrating human resilience and goodness. But that Wednesday morning when Victoria shared her 9 words of radical perspective, Ellen discovered something even more powerful. The transformative truth that sometimes losing everything is the only way to find out what you're really worth. Because sometimes the richest people are the ones who have learned that true wealth isn't what you can buy, it's what you can become. And sometimes the most valuable lesson in success comes from someone who has failed spectacularly and emerged with wisdom worth more than any fortune ever could be. The ripple effects of Victoria's story continued long after the cameras stopped rolling. Letters poured into the Ellen Show from viewers who had been struggling with their own definitions of success and happiness. Many wrote about feeling trapped in golden handcuffs, high-paying jobs that left them empty, expensive lifestyles that brought no joy, social status that masked deep loneliness. One particularly moving response came from Marcus Chen, a hedge fund manager in New York, who wrote, "I watched Victoria's interview 3 times before I had the courage to admit that I'm miserable despite my 7-figure salary. I realized I've been chasing money instead of meaning, accumulating wealth instead of building relationships." Her story gave me permission to redefine what success means to me. The True Wealth Foundation's methodology became revolutionary in its simplicity. Instead of traditional financial planning that focused solely on accumulation, Victoria's program taught a 3-pillar approach: purpose, why you work; people, who you serve; and peace, how you measure enough. Participants learned to ask not, "How can I make more?" but "How can I matter more?" Victoria's personal transformation continued to deepen. 5 years after losing her billions, she met David Rodriguez, a social worker who ran programs for at-risk youth. Their relationship, built on shared values and mutual respect rather than financial compatibility, became another example of her redefined wealth. They married in a simple ceremony at the women's shelter where Victoria volunteered, surrounded by people who had nothing material to offer but everything meaningful to give. The documentary about Victoria's journey, titled The Billionaire Who Found Herself, revealed additional layers to her story. Hidden from her original Ellen interview was the devastating personal cost of her pursuit of wealth. Missed family gatherings, neglected friendships, a first marriage that crumbled under the pressure of her obsession with success. The film showed how losing her fortune had actually restored her ability to connect authentically with others. Corporate leaders began inviting Victoria to speak at companies experiencing ethical crises or employee burnout. Her message resonated particularly with executives who recognized themselves in her story of success addiction. "I thought I was building an empire," she would tell audiences, "but I was actually building a prison. The bars were made of gold, but they were still bars." Ellen's final interview with Victoria, conducted 7 years after their first meeting, revealed the full scope of her transformation. Victoria had written 3 more books, spoken at the United Nations about sustainable development, and seen the True Wealth Foundation expand to 12 countries. But perhaps most remarkably, multiple studies showed that people who completed her program reported higher life satisfaction scores than control groups with significantly higher incomes. "The greatest irony," Victoria reflected in that final interview, "is that I now influence more lives and create more positive change than I ever did as a billionaire. When I had billions, I thought I was powerful, but real power isn't what you can buy. It's what you can inspire. It's not what you can own, it's what you can awaken in others." The True Wealth Foundation's research contributed to a growing body of academic work on happiness economics, proving what Victoria had discovered experientially, that beyond meeting basic needs, additional wealth provided diminishing returns on life satisfaction, while purpose-driven work and meaningful relationships showed exponential benefits to well-being. Victoria's story became required reading in several MBA programs, not as a cautionary tale about financial risk, but as a case study in authentic leadership and values-based success. Her willingness to publicly examine her failures and share hard-earned wisdom challenged traditional business education paradigms that equated success solely with profit maximization. As Ellen's show concluded its historic run, Victoria's episode was cited as one of the most transformative segments in the series' history. The final statistics were remarkable. The True Wealth Foundation had directly impacted over 50,000 individuals, influenced policy changes in 3 countries, and spawned dozens of similar organizations worldwide focused on holistic definitions of success and well-being.